I would like to welcome fan favorite Dr. Peter Henriquez. Tonight, he will be exploring the infamous election of 1800, a topic we explore in a variety of different ways at Gadsby's. Dr. Henriquez is a professor emeritus from George Mason University and author of Realistic Visionary, A Portrait of George Washington. And we are excited to announce that Peter has a new book out, First and Always, A New Portrait of George Washington. I'm going to turn over to Peter so he can present for our lecture. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thanks, Liz, and welcome to everyone. This is strange. Long ago, when I initially set up this date with Liz at Gadsby's Tavern, I envisioned introducing my new book on George Washington, signing some copies, and reestablishing contact with the wonderful folks who have attended so many of my past talks at Gadsby's Tavern. I really don't know how many they are. My guess is at least 30. Today is an outlier for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't focus on my favorite subject, George Washington. I think the only other time I did that was when I discussed the Burr-Hamilton duel. And another outlier is it's a virtual presentation. And I know that will never replace an in-person one, but it's the best we have at the moment. And hopefully the next one will be in person. Now on to the business at hand in touching on the election of 1800. Harry Truman once said, "The only thing new is the history we do not know." Of course, that's not completely accurate because history does not actually repeat itself. But history tends to be repetitious because human nature repeats itself. One of the reasons why history can not only be entertaining, but instructive as well. These thoughts came to me as I was preparing this presentation on the election of 1800. There are, as you'll see, a surprising number of similarities to the election 2020, although of course many differences as well. Politicians then and now were driven by personal ambition. Tactics were similar, and often the low road was followed. It led them to ridicule and smear their foes, to search for scandal in the behavior of their adversaries. I know it's hard to believe, but the puritanical John Adams was charged with bringing concubines from England for his sexual pleasure. To play on raw emotions, to manipulate the political system to their advantage. I came upon this quote from Abigail Adams, which I think we could have seen in this morning's paper. "We shall hear nothing else but abuse and scandal, enough to ruin and corrupt the minds and morals of the best people in the world." See what I mean about history being repetitious? Now, on any short list of pivotal moments in American history, the election of 1800 will always hold a central place. Thomas Jefferson referred to it as the Revolution of 1800. It's the first modern political campaign in our history. It's the first peaceful transfer of power from one political group to another in modern history. Although for a while, the issue was touch and go. Adding to its appeal, the election involves larger than life figures. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, Aaron Burr, with the recently deceased George Washington lurking in the background. Now, as background to the election of 1800, we need to focus a little bit on the Founding Fathers' decision to set up the Electoral College. At the Constitutional Convention, there was a great deal of discussion on how to choose the president once they decided on a single individual, which was debated. But it was hard to find common ground. The idea of simply having the people vote for him had virtually no support. Frankly, the idea was simply too democratic for the time. But there was another important factor in their thinking, and that was how to allocate power between the large states and the smaller states. As most of you know, under the Articles of Confederation, smaller states essentially had veto power. And consequently, they were understandably worried that any new system that parceled out power strictly according to population would inevitably cost them influence and protection. Now, ultimately, the convention decided that the president should be chosen by a group of electors, and that each state was to have a number of electors equal to the number of delegates that state had in Congress. In other words, the members of the House of Representatives plus the 2 senators that every state had. These electors were to be chosen in a manner decided by each state, possibly by the state legislature or by the people, either in a statewide vote or in district vote. Just out of curiosity, you might be interested to know in 1800, state legislatures made the choice in 11 of the 16 states. Now, important in their conception of the Electoral College, the framers viewed the electors as a group of well-qualified men. Obviously, women didn't fit into their thinking at this time. These were well-qualified men who were to exercise their collective judgment in picking the best qualified men to be the president and to be the vice president. Now, each elector was to vote for 2 men for president, one of whom could not be from their home state. It should be noted, there's no mechanism by which they could distinguish which of the 2 men they preferred for the presidency. If an individual won a majority of the total number of electoral votes, he would be president. And whatever person received the next highest number, whatever it was, would be the vice president. Well, what if no candidate received a majority? Of course, everyone at the Constitutional Convention expected that George Washington would receive a huge majority of the electoral votes. In actual fact, he received every single electoral vote, both in 1788 and 1792. That's really a remarkable achievement. Of course, it's never been equaled in the future. But what about after Washington? It's interesting to note that the framers anticipated that normally no candidate would amass a majority of the vote. It's not generally realized, but the solution they arrived at was actually another compromise between the large states and the small states. The founders essentially viewed the electors as an elite nominating committee. Then the House of Representatives would choose the president from those who got the top 5 vote getters. And what's important to note, each state, regardless of the size of their congressional delegation, would have only 1 vote. By the way, all these things are true today. Clearly, this arrangement would give proportionately significantly more power to the small states in making the final decision. For example, Virginia, the largest state, had 19 representatives in the House. It would have 1 vote, which would be determined by a majority of the delegation. Delaware, with a single delegate, would also have 1 vote. Now, the idea of the electors being an elite committee quickly proved to be impractical. Why? Frankly, the founders simply failed to envision the development of organized political parties. Once that happened, and it is in the process of happening in the 1790s, the electors were chosen with the idea that they would support the party's choice, not that they would use their own best judgment along that line. Now, against that background, let's take a look at this remarkable election of 1800. With the exception of the decade before the Civil War, the last several years of the 18th century were the most politically contentious and divisive in United States history, at least until our own time. I hate to say it, but I think our time will join that very undesirable list. Jefferson commented on how it impacted socializing among political opponents, and I'm sure many of us have felt that tension between those who are on different sides that were friends, and there's an awkwardness. Jefferson wrote, men who have been intimate all their lives cross the street to avoid meeting and turning their heads another way, lest they should be obliged to touch their hats. Now, the intense partisanship of our own time should help us better understand how the opponents of 1790 felt about each other. Not good. I saw this painting of how would Washington feel about the election then and now. I think that's the way he would feel. Not good. Now, basically, in the election of 1800, and you will hear this very much resonating today, each side felt that the fate of the country rested on them winning power. The other side was not only wrong, they were dangerously wrong. And indeed, they would destroy the country if they got power. Now, it's not easy to drop the resemblance to the Federalist Party, which is basically made up of factions led by John Adams and Alexander Hamilton. Eventually, it becomes the modern Republican Party. The original Republican Party, represented by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, evolves into today's Democratic Party. Federalists tilted to the right, the Republicans to the left. Now, the major factor impacting America in the 1790s was the French Revolution and its aftermath, one of the most significant events, really, in human history. As the Federalists saw the tumultuous sequence of events, with the guillotine working overtime, they concluded that an unfettered democracy imposed a leveling faction which would ultimately lead to anarchy, atheism, and tyranny. Now, the relations between America and France, remember, France had been our ally in the American Revolution and had great support among the American people. But they reached a nadir in 1798 following an incident known as the XYZ affair. France treated our ambassadors, they had been sent by John Adams on a peace mission, but they were treated with dismissive contempt. The French delegates demanded large bribes and loans, even to start negotiations. And when the country eventually learned of the outrage, their response was summarized by the famous slogan, "Million for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute." War seemed inevitable, and President Adams and the Federalists gained temporary popularity, and the Republicans, being more pro-French, were put very much on the defensive. Now, if your Federalist glasses are on, the Republican Party, especially Thomas Jefferson, really were Francophiles, lovers of France, basically little more than a French party in the United States, openly hostile to the American government. Now, with war fever raging, the Federalist-controlled Congress saw two major perils on the home front. One was an increasing number of foreign immigrants of questionable loyalty, and the other was the growing power of the Republican press. Federalists regarded opposition newspapers' attacks on the government as scurrilous, even seditious. And to deal with these two issues, Congress passed and John Adams signed the very controversial Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. Now, the Alien Acts increased the required period of residency to qualify for citizenship from a reasonable 5-year period to an unreasonable 14 years. And it allowed the president to expel all immigrants from any country with whom we were at war, as well as any immigrant that he personally considered dangerous to the country, whatever he said. And the Sedition Acts made it a crime punishable by fine and imprisonment to produce, and I quote, any false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or the president or the Congress that might stir people to sedition. As one supporter expressed it, there's evidence everywhere of the necessity of purifying the country from the sources of pollution, i.e. from fake news. And that's what they saw the Republican press. Now, as they approached the election of 1800, the following editorial, I think, gives you a good view of how the Federalists viewed the case. It goes this way. You who are for French notions of government, for the tempestuous sea of anarchy and misrule, for arming the poor against the rich, for fraternizing with the foes of God and man, go to the left and support the leaders or dupes of the anti-federal junta. But you that are sober, industrious, thriving, and happy, give your votes to those men who mean to preserve the union of the states, the purity and vigor of our elected excellent Constitution, and the sacred majesty of the laws and the holy ordinance of religion. In their mind, as one Republican newspaper put it, the French-loving Republicans have made liberty and equality their pretext, while plunder and dominion has been their cause. Now, in the heated atmosphere of the 1790s, the Federalists feared no Republican like they feared Thomas Jefferson, and they would do virtually everything to keep him from winning office. Now, what they managed to do in the most pervasive charge leveled by the Federalists was that Jefferson, infected by French radicalism, was an atheist, and that his election would be an unimaginable catastrophe. Frankly, I could fill the rest of the talk with examples of extreme attacks on Jefferson's dangerous views on religion and what it would mean for the country. A couple of examples. If Jefferson is elected, these are exact quotes, by the way. Our churches may become temples of reason, our Bibles cast into the fire. Or again, murder, robbery, rape, adultery, and incest will be openly taught and practiced, and the soil will be soaked with blood and the nation black with crimes. I kid you not, this is, if Thomas Jefferson is president, this is what's going to happen. As one Federalist newspaper summarized it prior to the election, and it goes this way. Every American must lay his hand on his heart and ask whether he continues in allegiance to God and a religious president, or impiously declares for Jefferson and no God. If that's the case, you could see how they would expect the vote. They revived the infamous Matsai letter as a campaign cudgel. Federalists reminded that Thomas Jefferson had slandered their greatest hero, George Washington, who was dead for less than a year. Back in April of 1796, Jefferson had written to his Italian friend, Philip Matsai, who had spent time with him at Monticello. And he wrote and said, it would give you a fever were I to name to you the apostates who have gone over to these heresies against republicanism. Men who were Samsons in the field and Solomons in the council, but they've had their head shaved by the harlot England. How could Americans elect a man so duplicitous and underhanded? A man who would secretly attack Washington in this way. Interestingly enough, it led to the most famous early political cartoon in American history, called Providential Detection. If you look at the cartoon on the screen, you'll see Jefferson is prostrate at the altar of Gallic despotism, French despotism, on which radical writings attempting to destroy the American Constitution fuel the fire. And you notice Jefferson is ready to drop the American Constitution and they sacrifice the country's government and independence as a burnt offering. Just as he's ready to do it, an eagle dives down. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the eye of God guiding the eagle. And note in the lower left-hand corner, as the eagle strikes, the Matsai letter attacking Washington slips from its right hand of Jefferson, whose face betrays a look of utter horror as providential detection comes. Well, what about the Republican argument that it was essential to defeat the Federalists in 1800? As the Federalists shut down newspapers, imprisoned editors for violating the Sedition Act, The Republicans argued that it demonstrated President Adams' despotic disregard for individual liberty. Jefferson saw it as a first step. He said, if it's not stopped, it will lead to the end of the American spirit experiment in republicanism and to the establishment of monarchy. And many Republicans were convinced that Adams was a closet monarchist. And a monarchist is a very highly charged word, like the word communist is today. Read the news tonight. You'll see it used. As the anti-establishment newspaper, the Aurora, put it, the Federalist is a mask for monarchy. This is the danger. As they elected and shut down newspapers, I jailed both journalists and even congressmen. Matthew Lyon from Vermont was arrested and put in prison for violating the Sedition Act. It's a famous cartoon. He was attacked on the floor of the House by a Roger Griswold. He picked up fire tongs, and this is a cartoon. Things were not all calm back then either. We have not seen quite that kind of incident. The Federalists called for a standing army, which was to be paid for by heavy taxation, was as frightening as the Sedition Act. And by the way, every officer of the new army was a Federalist. Indeed, the Republicans were convinced that the new army's purpose was similar to the Sedition Act, namely to cow critics and suppress opinions that were hostile to the government. If your Republican glasses are on, there's not much difference between the Federalists now and the Tories during the American Revolution. Both were reactionary enemies of the American dream. Do we want a leader who is a steadfast friend of the right to the people, or do we want someone who's an advocate for hereditary power and distinctions favoring the well-born? In summary, in the view of the Republicans, the Federalists condemned the principles of 1776, were monarchists bent on war with France, supported policies that favored the rich, made victims of new immigrants, supported the established churches, increased public debt and taxes, and sought to destroy a free press and to create a standing army. They had to be defeated. If Jefferson were president, they said he would tax less, spend less, do less, leaving the people freer to do for themselves, especially in the realm of religious freedom, which was an important factor at that time. Now let's look at the presidential campaign itself. As we look at the 2020 campaign, observers on both sides study the electoral map. What is the path to win the 270 electoral votes that are necessary for victory? How did Trump reach that winning number in 2016? And what states did the Democrats have to take back to deny him victory in 2020? So it was in 1800, exactly the same. Then a candidate only had to amass a total of 70 electoral votes. There were only a total of 139. In 1796, John Adams had narrowly defeated Thomas Jefferson by a margin of 71 to 68. Because Federalist electors split their vote among the second choice, Jefferson ended up being vice president to the man who had just narrowly defeated him. Of course, that was changed by the 12th Amendment following the election we're looking at, but it is still a possibility in the 1800 campaign. The Republicans analyzed, where did Adams' 71 votes come from? And as they looked at it, they realized that the northern states were solidly for Adams. The South, with the possible exception of South Carolina, were solid for Jefferson. It was the middle states that were the most vulnerable. But they also noticed two things. Adams won a single, if you look at your chart, Pennsylvania, 14 to 1 for Jefferson. Virginia was 20 to 1 for Jefferson. North Carolina was 11 to 1 for Jefferson. If Jefferson could have won two of those 3 votes, he would have been president 70 to 69. So to ensure, Virginia changed the rules. The legislature said all electors will be chosen in a single statewide election, eliminating any possibility that the Federalists might get some votes in Virginia. The other key point in examining the election of 1796, if you see on the chart, the Federalists carried all 12 of New York's electoral votes. Now, if the Republicans could carry New York, or at least some of New York's electoral votes, Jefferson would most likely be the next president. Now, in 1796, the New York state legislature picked the electors. Since the legislature was controlled by the Federalists, all 12 of its votes went to Adams. The Republicans pushed hard. We should have the electors chosen by district vote, as was done, for example, in North Carolina. That would ensure at least some Republican votes. That effort failed. The only hope left for the Republicans was to win control of the state legislature. A very, very big job, a very unlikely job. The key to controlling the state legislature rested in New York City, historically a Federalist enclave controlled by Alexander Hamilton. Enter Aaron Burr, who plays what turns out to be the decisive role in the election of 1800. And some of you may be thinking, oh, I know this from the musical Hamilton, which is partially right, but I'm going to be a little more accurate than they are. Typically, Aaron Burr is portrayed as the villain among the founding fathers. And in my view, there is good reason for that assessment. But there is no denying his charm and his considerable talents, one of which was that he possessed, as one person put it, to a preeminent degree, the art of fascinating the youthful. He was a very skilled politician, in some ways America's first modern politician. And he got severely criticized by the Federalists for openly campaigning in the manner he did, and the way candidates regularly do now, but it was not done. One critic said, how can a would-be vice president stoop so low to visit all these taverns that may happen to be crowded with his dear fellow citizens? With a singleness of purpose that awed friend and foe alike, Burr worked tirelessly to carry New York City for the Republicans in the April 1800 state election. To enhance the chances of a Republican victory, Burr recruited a stellar slate of candidates, men like former Governor George Clinton and General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to stand against Hamilton's much more lackluster list of candidates. Then on election day, Burr led a remarkable push to get the vote out, especially in the poorer sections of New York City with a heavy immigrant population. Ultimately, the 6th Ward, New York City's poorest district, comprising mostly the unsettled stretch of Manhattan Island above what's now Canal Street, was the difference in the Republican victory. Turnout was the key to victory. Essentially, the allegiance of the new immigrants tipped the scale, and the ultimate result was that all 12 of New York's electoral votes would now go to the Republican. Alexander Hamilton was so distraught that he committed what Ron Chernow called the most high-handed and undemocratic act of his career. He urged Governor John Jay to call the legislature back into session to pass a law allowing the vote for electors to be done by legislative districts, exactly what the Republicans had wanted to do and the Federalists had defeated. Basically, having lost by the agreed upon rules, Hamilton wanted to play the game again under different rules. And interestingly, he explained why. In times like this, in which we live, to prevent an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics from getting possession of the state, it will not do to be over-scrupulous. To his credit, John Jay put the request aside with a comment, solely for party purposes, I shouldn't consider. Well, while New York proved to be the crucial state, the election was not a done deal. Two other keys were South Carolina and Pennsylvania. The situation in Pennsylvania is complicated beyond our ability to look at. The Republicans controlled the House, the Federalists narrowly controlled the Senate, and it seemed for a while that Pennsylvania's votes would not be cast at all. A compromise, unsatisfactory to the Republicans. Remember, they carried the state in 1796, 14-1. It gave Jefferson an 8-7 victory. Therefore, to take the White House, the Republicans needed South Carolina. And the situation in South Carolina is confusing because the vice presidential candidate for the Federalist Party was from that state. C.C. Pinckney, a general in the American Revolution, a man widely respected and likely to get some electoral votes in his home state. His brother, Thomas Pinckney, had been Adams' vice president in 1796 and had actually shared the electoral votes with Jefferson. Indeed, there was a possibility that South Carolina again would cast its vote for a Jefferson and a Pinckney. If that happened, Pinckney might actually end up becoming president. He would have more electoral votes than Adams and hopefully more than Jefferson. This is exactly what Alexander Hamilton hoped to achieve. Now, Hamilton and Adams were both Federalists, but Hamilton really got to despise Adams. At one point, he was so frustrated, he even commented, "I think I'd rather have Jefferson president. At least I know who my enemy is," as opposed to. He, along with many of what were called high Federalists, the more conservative wing of the party, sometimes they were called ultras, they were very angered at Adams had taken a new peace initiative with France. Really, Adams deserves credit for this. Adams was willing to sacrifice his personal popularity for what he thought was the good of the country. Indeed, I like the image of Adams carrying his flag of self-righteousness, stopping now and then to salute it. He wanted his tombstone to read, "Here lies John Adams, who took upon himself the responsibility of peace with France in the year 1800. Unfortunately for Adams, he did get peace, but it came too late to help him in the election. And Hamilton wrote a scathing letter in October to the leaders of the Federalist Party, more a pamphlet than a letter. The Aurora newspaper got hold of it, and it went viral pre-industrial style. Hamilton did not quite call Adams crazy, but he did accuse him of being mentally unstable and unfit to do the job here. Just one second. Where's my? Okay, here we go. He referred to Adams' extreme egotism, his distempered jealousy, ungovernable temper, vanity without bounds. It shocked and angered many members of his own party. It actually hurt Hamilton's position of leadership, and its impact on the election, according to the experts, was pretty minimal. Now, South Carolina was the last of the 16 state legislatures to meet. They convened November 24th of 1800. Their choice of electors had to be done by December 3rd of 1800. Each of the two parties put up 8 electors. That's what South Carolina was entitled to. And of those 16 men, the legislatures were to vote for 8 individuals. Now, some of the legislators seemed poised to vote for Jefferson and C.C. Pinckney. Interestingly, Pinckney, acting out of a sense of honor and anger at Hamilton's article and tirade, said he would only want support from men who would vote both for him and for Adams. He didn't want people who would vote for him and Jefferson. Ultimately, the legislators chose 8 electors, all pledged to Jefferson. Once the South Carolina vote was known, of course, there was no CNN or Steve Kornacki filling in the electoral map. It was clear that Jefferson would triumph over his rival and be the next president of the United States. Yet a few weeks later, something else became clear. In a screw-up of major proportions, the Republicans had not made clear which elector would cast a vote for Jefferson and for someone other than Burr. And because of that oversight, Jefferson and Burr ended up tied with 73 electoral votes each. Adams got 65, Pinckney 64, because the Federalists threw one of their votes away to John Jay. Now, you might well think, well, what's the big deal? After all, every one of the 73 electors meant Jefferson to be president and Burr to be vice president. That's true, but there was no way, remember, for them to specify that fact on their ballots. And the Constitution made clear if there were a tie, the House of Representatives would immediately decide the winner in the manner that I explained earlier, voting by states, one vote for each state. And while the Republicans swept a victory in the fall elections of 1800, the lame duck Congress consisted of more Federalists than Republicans. And it was the lame duck session which would decide the election. Now, from our modern perspective, one may understandably assert denying Jefferson the presidency would be absolutely outrageous violation of the public will. I mean, it couldn't have, I think, a more clear, outrageous example. Yet, from the Federalist point of view, the overwhelming majority, almost all, not quite all, but almost all, of the Federalists in Congress did not see it that way. They interpreted the Constitution's mandate to mean that they were to use their best individual judgment to pick the man they believed most suited to be president, much like the electors were to do. And virtually to a man, these Federalists were convinced that that man was not Thomas Jefferson. Remember, they had the entire thrust of the Federalist campaign was to convince people that Jefferson's election would be a catastrophe of almost incalculable proportions. They viewed the tie, frankly, as a heaven-sent opportunity to keep him from power and save the country. One prominent Federalist did not agree. Alexander Hamilton's loathing for Aaron Burr trumped his enmity towards Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton worked ferociously to convince Federalists not to vote for Burr. And interestingly enough, this is pulled from a couple of, not all from this particular time, his assessment of Burr. Some people, you could put other names in these quotes and maybe they'd have a more contemporary ring. As to Burr, he loves nothing but himself. Public principles have no other spring or aim than his own aggrandizement. Burr is sanguine enough to hope everything, daring enough to try anything, wicked enough to scruple nothing. In a word, if we have an embryo Caesar in the United States, it is Burr. Now, underlying Hamilton's aggressive campaign for Jefferson was a fear that American democracy or republicanism was too fragile to survive a man of Burr's towering ambition. And he explained why, again, in an interesting quote with contemporary ring. The truth is that under forms of government like ours, too much is practicable to a man who will without scruple avail themselves of the bad passions of human nature. Frankly, Hamilton's protestations had minimal impact. The Speaker of the House, Theodore Sedgwick, explained why, despite Burr's poor character, he should be president. Sedgwick said, yes, he's ambitious, selfish, profligate. Aaron Burr is the Don Juan of the American founding fathers, and to an amazing degree. He has a love of power, but he's well-bred, has no pernicious theories. His very selfishness will keep him from entertaining any mischievous predilections for foreign nations. Sedgwick argued Burr needs the Federalist support to govern. He couldn't get him without our supporting some of our views. In other words, Burr was the better of the two. Now, despite their lame duck majority, as it turned out, the House Federalists did not control enough states to elect Burr. In 1800, as I mentioned, there's 16 states. So the winner had to acquire the votes of 9 of those states, each state voting by their congressional delegate. And the Republicans controlled 8: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Kentucky, Tennessee. The Federalists had New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Delaware, and South Carolina. 2, Vermont and Maryland, were divided. Thus, when the House met in February of 1801 to choose the president, the result on the first ballot was 8 states for Thomas Jefferson, 6 states for Aaron Burr, and 2 divided. So it was on the second ballot and the third ballot, and on for over 30 ballots over the course of a very stressful week where really people were not sure how this could be resolved. As the stalemate dragged on, there were widespread rumors of civil war or secession. If the Federalists refused to recognize the will of the people, that is the inevitable result. And people wondered what would happen if March 4th, that was the time the president was inaugurated, came and the election had not yet been decided. What if Congress chose an interim president in the meantime? All sorts of wild and scarier scenarios were put forth. There were rumors of assassination, arson, military preparation, revolution, and civil war swirled around the new and basically primitive capital of Washington, D.C. And by the way, the congressmen lived in lousy boarding houses, all the Federalists together, the Republicans together, and they fed on each other. It was a very tense situation. As one Republican newspaper put it, usurpation must be resisted by freemen whenever they have the power of resistance. Jefferson verbally warned Adams to expect resistance by force and incalculable consequences. But there was, of course, no way of knowing what would have happened had the stalemate not been broken. Aaron Burr's role in this is somewhat controversial. This is a bust of him as vice president. Basically, some people support Burr. He didn't make any outward reach to the Federalists, and they say he acted honorably. Personally, I don't think so. Burr didn't do what I view was the only honorable thing to do, namely recognize the clear fact the electors had meant to choose Jefferson for president, and therefore he should state explicitly and categorically that he would step aside. Basically, he should have done something similar to what Pinckney did in South Carolina. Instead, once it was clear there was a tie, he declared to Jefferson's contact person, Samuel Smith, that he would accept the presidency if offered. My own view is if Burr actively tried to get Republicans to vote for them, and every Republican in Congress had voted for Jefferson, he would get them so angry they never would change. His only hope would be that the stalemate went on, and some of the more moderate Republicans said it's better to have Burr a president than no president at all. In other words, my sense is that Burr did the best he could to achieve the presidency, despite the fact that none of the electors desired him to be. Now, to win, Burr needed to change 3 votes. Jefferson only needed to change 1. That leads to the next and last key figure in our story, Delaware's Congressman James Bayard. Bayard was a moderate Federalist, a champion of Hamilton's financial program, and he was Delaware's sole delegate. He switched his vote. Jefferson would have 9 states and the president. And believe me, Hamilton worked hard and long to try to convince him. A long letter admitting that Jefferson was a bum in lots of ways, but very interesting, and a little bit like in the musical. Hamilton continued that he is a man of character. He is not a zealot. He won't ruin the financial system. Yes, he's not a good choice, but he's far better choice than Burr would be. And Bayard, who was influenced by Hamilton, through Jefferson's intermediary, Samuel Smith, wanted to receive guarantees from Jefferson as things he would not do if Bayard was to change his vote. He wanted Jefferson to promise not to undermine the national bank that Hamilton had set up. And he also wanted Jefferson to say he would not remove people that Bayard had placed in government jobs. Did Jefferson make concessions to become president? Maybe. It's still a point of controversy among the experts. But whatever was said by Jefferson, and however Smith reported it to Bayard, it proved decisive. Bayard, genuinely fearful of what would happen if the stalemate continued, was satisfied with Jefferson's reply. He withdrew his opposition. The logjam was finally broken, and after 36 ballots, Thomas Jefferson was elected the third president of the United States. But interestingly, Bayard did not actually vote for Jefferson. He simply withheld his vote. Federalists in the divided states of Maryland and Vermont did the same. So Jefferson ended up winning 10 states. But he did so without a single Federalist who had voted against him actually changing their vote. It was a sign of just how bitterly they opposed him. Partisanship prevailed to the bitter end and showed no signs of abating. It had not been pretty. It almost didn't happen. John Adams would leave Washington on the day of Jefferson's inauguration. By the way, the only sitting president to date to refuse attendance at the inauguration of a successor. But the key point is that power was peacefully passed from one political party to an opposing party for the first time in modern history. It began a tradition in the United States that has been unbroken ever since, and it has been a shining example to the rest of the world. The peaceful transfer of power is the crown jewel of American democracy. And it saddens me to have to end this lecture with raising the question whether that priceless tradition of over 220 years might come to an end. Only time will tell, and will soon provide an answer to that critical question. Now, I'll be willing to take questions in just a moment. So I hope this has stirred up some questions. You know, I always end my talks. Lots of questions I can't answer. No foolish questions. So I will turn it over to Liz if they've gotten some questions, and we'll go from there.
So our first one is, do you think there was any French interference in this election process?
That's a good question. There certainly were rumors of French intervention. I really have not studied it with the kind of detail that I would be able to do. I know it. They were worried about that in 1796 and in 1800 as well. The Federalists feared that. But there was some attempt. I just don't have the confidence in my ability to answer the question with certainty.
Absolutely, no problem. So our next question is, how much flexibility do electors have today compared to 1800?
How much, the question of how much flexibility electors have. The electors, it depends what state they're in. The Supreme Court very recently, I don't know exactly, but within the last months, agreed that states may pass a law insisting that the electors vote the way the people of the state. So, for example, if Virginia goes for Biden, one of Biden's supporters could not change his mind if Virginia had passed the law. A number of states have passed the law. I'm sorry, I don't know the number. I think it will obviously increase because the idea, I mean, we're actually not voting for Trump or for Biden. We're voting for a group of electors, flesh and blood people that you can meet in the store and shake hands with. And they could vote for me if they so chose. I mean, in most states, there's no legal obligation. And very often there are changes. Usually the number of electoral votes are so big, it doesn't make any difference if one candidate or two or three vote for someone else. If you want to write a good novel and imagine that there's only one or two electors between the difference, like the 71 to 68 kind of vote, and then you get bribed two people, convinced two people that were on one side to switch to the other. So that's the other thing I might mention in connection with this process. If no one gets a majority of the electoral votes, it goes to the House of Representatives, where each state has one vote. Now you might say, well, there are only two people running. Someone's got to get a majority. But in actual fact, let's say there's a conflict in the state of Michigan. And Michigan's votes are not counted at all. And it's a close vote. Neither one gets 270. Then it would go into the House, the lame duck session of the House. And in the lame duck session of the House, 23 of the states are controlled by Republican delegates. And 20, I think there was one tie. The rest were Democrats and one Republican. So that's theoretically possible that would happen, because the Constitution sets it up, and that's still the way it would do. It would go into the House of Representatives. My own guess, I don't expect that to happen, but that is theoretically possible to happen. And it seems to me, if I could make just a comment on the electors, which a lot of people would say, why don't we have just popular vote? It might make a good case for it. It's not going to happen because the small states will not give up their relative power. But it does seem to me that one thing you could do to get people more involved is to have the electors chosen by district instead of by the whole state. In other words, Virginia has 11 congressional districts. Whoever Trump wins Virginia, he gets the 2 senators' votes and whatever districts he controls. So he may end up with 7, and Biden may end up with 6. It would spread out, because in a lot of the states, both red and blue, although you want to vote absolutely and assert your right to vote, most of these states are already determined. But if you had a system where they voted by electoral districts, which they did, like in North Carolina in 1790s, then I think it would stimulate more interest and bring more people into the process. I think that's conceivable. A direct popular vote, however appealing it sounds, you have to amend the Constitution. You have to get 3/4 of the states to say okay, and that is not likely to happen, because the small states, like Delaware, they have power. If it were just pure popular vote, they'd have power like Fairfax County would.
Right. Well, we have a lot more questions to get to, so I'm excited that people.
I'm sorry, I
popped in. No, I'm just letting you know you got a lot. So the next question is, how did Jefferson's letter to Mazie get, if I pronounce that correctly, become public? How did somebody get
the letter to Philip Matsai? He wrote it as a private letter. Matsai, in an unbelievable poor choice, sent it on to a friend. It got published in a French newspaper. Someone translated it into England, where it was published in England, and then it was sent back and published in America. It came out after Washington had actually left office, but it confirmed, in my first book, Realistic Visionary, I have a chapter on Washington and Jefferson, and this goes far. I mean, for someone to call George Washington an apostate, apostate is someone who believes in something and then rejects it. But apostate to republicanism. Washington never forgave Jefferson, and their relations were very strained. And when Jefferson came to visit Mount Vernon after he was elected president, Martha Washington said, "The worst day of my life was when my husband died. The second worst day was when Thomas Jefferson came to visit." There's a lot of bitterness and hostility.
And we tell a little bit of that story because after his visit to Martha Washington, he actually stays at Gadsby's. He stays at the City Hotel that night. So
that quote, by the way, that quote was not given to Jefferson. It was later said to other Federalist friends. I'm sure she was a nice hostess when he was there, but you could sense in that. And I hear in her complaint the voice of her husband and their dinner conversation. I didn't realize that Jefferson actually stayed at Gadsby's right after this.
Yep, he left. He went to D.C. or he's in D.C. waiting for what the House is doing. It's the beginning. It's January, so we suspect he had another senator with him. So it was him and a traveling companion went to visit Martha, pay his respects. Didn't make it all the way back to DC in time and spent the night in Alexandria. So
very interesting.
He paid $5.50 for dinner and lodging.
Okay.
All right. So The next question is, how is slavery portrayed in the election?
The issue of course, one of the things, there is a book called The Negro President, which the reason the book is entitled The Negro President is because Thomas Jefferson would not have won the election except that the population of the states was determined 3/5 of the slaves counted for reasons of population. If the slaves had not counted for population, the electoral vote from the southern states would have been less and John Adams would have won. As far as an issue in the election, it really isn't a big issue. It will be later on. Washington had done what he could to tamp down the issue of slavery. There was a Quaker petition against slavery, which he managed to have buried. Why? Because from Washington's perspective, indeed from many people's perspective, slavery was so explosive a topic that it would destroy the Union if it became front and center. So the way to deal with it is to keep it down and hope later on it will gradually go away. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But as far as I can tell in my own reading, other than the retrospective look, that it was because of the increased electoral votes in the southern states that allowed Jefferson to win, there wasn't a debate where one candidate, and of course Jefferson was vocally anti-slavery in his views, especially at this time, and John Adams was very strongly, and Hamilton very strongly anti-slavery. It's not a significant.
Got it. Okay. So our next question was, how long did it take for things to quiet down after Jefferson's inauguration?
I only gave the talk on the election. I'm not a Jefferson scholar, so I'm not certain. But one thing that Jefferson did if Biden ends up president, I wouldn't be surprised if he quotes Jefferson. Jefferson's first quote in his inaugural address said, "We're all Republicans, we're all Federalists." Now, privately, he knew some Federalists were beyond the pale and the hell with them. But his open view was, and Jefferson is not, the way I portrayed him in this Federalist picture, this is an erudite, thoughtful, sensitive man. The idea that he's some kind of crazy fanatic that's going to go wild just doesn't jive with the reality of what people actually felt. So, all I can say is that Jefferson, basically the Federalist Party is destroyed. They'll never elect another candidate. The Republican Party becomes the absolute dominant party. Jefferson easily wins re-election. Madison easily wins. There is trouble with the War of 1812. But when Monroe was elected president in 1820, every single elector was going to vote for him. The Federalist Party had died. They couldn't win a single electoral vote. One elector decided to vote for someone else so that George Washington would be the only person who won every single electoral vote. But that's how but of course the political views didn't die, and new parties, the National Republican Party that developed into the Whig Party and the modern Republican Party. But for a while, the Federalist Party dies, mainly, I think, because they're just too elitist in a time that is moving towards more and more democracy. And they're not going to shed their elitism. Vote for me because I'm smart, I love my country, and I'll do what's right. If you expect me to go out and beg you to vote for me, no way. I'm not going to do it. And that's how many of the Federalist leaders felt.
Right. Talking about Adams and Jefferson, can you comment on their relationship kind of after this tumultuous election?
The Adams-Jefferson relationship it's whole books on this, because they were good friends during the Revolution, even during the earlier period of the election. This damaged their relationship, and for a time, and Abigail Adams got to really despise Jefferson. She felt unfair to her husband. But years later, they start, and I should know the name of the person who got them to write letters to each other. and they write this one. I mean, these are the two smartest people in America, and they finally found someone who's smart enough to respond to all their. I mean, the amount of philosophy that they deal in these things is just amazing, and they end up being dear friends. And as most of the people in this audience, which I know is so well informed generally, knows that on July 4th, 1726, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both Jefferson and John Adams died on that day. In actual fact, Jefferson died first. John Adams did not know that, and his last words were rather prophetically, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." So if you're looking from a religious point of view for God, like the eye of God looking down, stamp of approval that these two founding fathers die on exactly the same day, and it is the 50th anniversary. But actually, one reason they died, they worked hard to stay alive. I mean, Jefferson was dying, and several times he said, "Is it the fourth yet?" I mean, to the end, they know, they care about their reputation. And to die on the fourth, they knew was a significant.
I think that needs to be Lin-Manuel's next musical. That whole,
Yeah.
that day, just in general.
And fair enough.
And we have two Aaron Burr questions. And this will be a speculation, fun question for you. So, how do you think the history of the country might have changed with a Burr presidency?
It's an interesting question. I'm not a big person on what if, because it's hard enough to figure out what did happen, yet alone what might have happened if other things, if Lee had won his Gettysburg or so on, if Lincoln had been assassinated on going to his inauguration. I personally, I distrust Burr deeply. I think it is worth noting that George Washington distrusted him deeply. John Adams distrusted him deeply. Thomas Jefferson distrusted him deeply. James Monroe distrusted him deeply. All of the founding fathers saw him as a very capable man, but a man without integrity, that was not bound by a code of honor that would keep him from doing certain things. That's the way his critics. Now, there's an Aaron Burr society that's devoted to his name, and there are a lot of champions, and there's some fairly good books that are quite sympathetic to Burr. So I mean, I'm giving you one point of view. I should say it's controversial. There are a minority of historians, capable historians, who would give Burr more the benefit of the doubt and argue that he did act honorably in a. Of course, once he lost and becomes vice president, needless to say, Jefferson's not going to have him vice president next time. Right. And so, with his path blocked that way, he tries to become the governor of New York. Hamilton blocks him to be the governor of New York. That leads to the duel. In the wonderful musical, the duel comes after the election of 1800. In actual fact, it comes after the governor's race in 1804. And where Burr's political career is over, he blames Hamilton and challenges, and we know the results of the most famous duel in all of American history, leading to the most popular musical, perhaps in all of America.
And that whole Aaron Burr treason storyline when he goes to try to take over the West.
I mean, later on, when after Burr's defeated and after he's defeated the governor, he's involved in the Burr conspiracy is what it's called, to try to lead the Western countries maybe to secession with him as the leader. It's murky, it's debatable. Thomas Jefferson arrests him for treason, wants to execute her, and John Marshall, his cousin, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, interprets the law in such a way that lets Burr go. What really damages Burr, he has one daughter, Theodosia Burr. He married the wife of a British officer who was killed in Georgia. His daughter, Theodosia, is probably the most refined, educated. She's obviously got some of her father's remarkable intelligence. he gets her married to the governor of South Carolina. She goes down there, has a child that she names for her father, and he dies. And Burr writes to his daughter, "Come to me, I'll comfort you." She gets on a ship and disappears in the ocean. And that really is the thing that triggers Burr off on his, goes to England for a while and all sorts of strange and unusual things. He ends up marrying Madame Jumel, who had a questionable past and lives in the big Jumel mansion in New York City. Believe it or not, she seeks divorce from Aaron Burr for adultery, of which he committed God only knows how many times. And her attorney was Alexander Hamilton's son. That's why you don't have to read novels. You know, you can read history. It's full of fascinating stuff, and it's true. Burr is really, he's a larger than life figure in many ways, as many of these founding fathers are.
That needs to be our next lectures. And some people say Theodosia is our female stranger at Gadsby's, but that's a whole other lecture. Can you expand on the specifics of how Burr got out the vote in New York City?
It was a combination. One of the things that I say this with a little more tentativeness than some of the others. One was his remarkable emphasis to get people to vote. And in those days, I'm not certain of the exact voting requirements, but what he did, he established a Republican bank and linked people into the bank, which allowed them to have the assets, even though they didn't control them. I may be a little fuzzy on the details, but his use of the bank was able to expand and get these votes. And basically, I mean, it was a question of him and, of course, many of other supporters. I mean, he was literally up for 24 hours in a row, going around, rallying people, trying to convince them that, you know, this is, as one of the newspapers put it, he said, the health of the country rests on your success. That, from the Republican point of view, the Federalists were the evil party of monarchy. And Burr was really, we had to carry New York to become president. And really, American democracy rests on Burr. And he gets enough supporters and work, and then with the connection of this bank to expand the electorate, and just getting people actually out to vote, manages to carry the state legislature.
What was the impact of the changes in the electoral system in the 1804 election?
The major change was that you no longer voted for two men for president. You voted for a ticket of a president and vice president. And that's been the way it has been ever since 1804. Jefferson was a very popular president. Remember, the Louisiana Purchase occurred in 1803. Obviously, the Federalists criticized him for extending the government power and so on and so forth. Interestingly, Hamilton supported it. Most of the Federalists bitterly opposed, but Hamilton supported the Louisiana Purchase. But it was not. I have not studied the election. It was not a particularly close.
Great. Well, thank you again, Peter, for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Pete, folks, for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've got questions, you can contact me at prhmeh@aol.com, and I'll be happy to answer them. So thanks for tuning in.